Now I'd like to welcome to the show Liya Palagashvili, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Welcome to Free the Economy, Liya.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
So, there's been a lot of debate over the last few years about the kinds of jobs Americans have. In particular, whether we're going to expect most of them to work for a big company or whether we expect a lot of them to work as independent contractors or gig workers. So, just to begin with, why should the rest of us, most of us who have jobs already, the lucky ones, why should we be thinking about this issue? Why is this like a big distinction in the American economy?
Well, to start off, actually, you might already have a side gig or a contracting gig because almost 40% of US workers engage in this type of work, either as their primary or secondary source of income. So you might have a full-time job that you go to, but uh, you might also have side jobs that you do, so contracting or consulting or public, if you get paid to do a public speaking gig, that's contracting and side gigs, right? If you get paid to write a research paper, that's also a side gig that you're doing. So you're part of this workforce, independent workforce already in some sense. The question is whether it'll become your main source of income in the next few years or decades. And by the way, for some people, it's already starting to be because of Substack. So as you know, Substackers, they're independent workers, they're independent contractors, self-employed. Um, and for those who have started it as a trial to see like how much side income can I make and so forth, some people might have seen like, wow, I can make a lot of income on this. Let me leave my full-time job and let this be my full or main source of income. And so to the extent that we see the growth of these technologies continue to emerge that kind of help facilitate these relationships, like Substack or Uber is the well-known one, right, for driving and so forth. But
Mm.
there's many others, even like Instagram, because we get Instagram influencers, right? And now they've become full-time Instagram influencers. That's self-employed, independent contracting, independent work jobs. So we will, from my understanding, my research of this, we are going to continue to see a growth in these types of jobs. And that's because of the technology that's advancing in these different areas that are lowering what's called, what economists call transaction cost. And so as a result, it might not be your full-time gig in the next decade, but maybe you'll pick up a couple gigs on the side as your side income. So it's quite important. And again, already 40% of US workers are engaging in this type of work, either as full-time or as secondary income.
So you have people, a significant percentage of Americans who, as you said, are either in the sort of 1099 world, that's the like tax form you get for supplemental income, or might likely going to be have opportunities to move in that direction. But of course, we always have to ask ourselves, yes, but what does the government say about this, right? Because a lot of employment is regulated by the federal government, and there's rules for employment in general, and rules for sort of unionized, organized employment. They're separate from that, and so the question of what is the government going to do to help or hinder us when we're looking for jobs is something we talk about a lot. And one narrative here that we hear a lot is that big companies want everyone to be gig workers, so they won't have to pay anyone health insurance or retirement accounts, and it'll be better for big companies for everyone to be gig workers. And so everyone who cares about the welfare of workers should want everyone to be full time because full time is the safe, better way of working. And so the current White House, Biden's Department of Labor issued this new rule earlier this year about the circumstances and rules under which a worker can be classified as independent rather than full time, rather than sort of permanent employee, um, trying to sort of push companies to make more to favor full time employment rather than classify people as contract and gig people. Um, and so a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's a good thing, right? Because the government is trying to like give workers this better full time employee status. But when you wrote about it recently, you said that this appeases activists, but the DOL, Department of Labor rule, is not a simple labor wins story. So what's the real deal?
So the real deal is when when these rules are enacted, like the Department of Labor rule that you mentioned, the assumption by regulators and policymakers is that there's going to be a one-for-one compositional change. So you, Richard, are an independent contractor for X large company. Now the rule goes into effect and you become an employee. Done deal. Everyone's happy, right? Except the company, because now they have to pay benefits, right? But you're happy because you become an employee of the company. You are, therefore, you're under labor protection laws like minimum wage and overtime, and you have access to a lot of employment-based benefits like health insurance and so forth. So that's the operating assumption that the regulators and the government says, like, Richard now becomes, he was an independent contractor, now he becomes an employee. Now, the reality is it's actually impossible for every independent contracting gig to turn into an employment opportunity.
Right.
And so if you think about something like let's say there's a company, a magazine company that contracts out with 100 photographers. Okay. And some of those photographers are providing photographs on a sporadic or irregular basis. And they are maybe doing, I don't know, 10 hours of work for your company, right? A month, 10 hours a month. Now, if that relationship now becomes illegal, that contracting relationship with the various different photographers, the question is, do all of those photographers now become full-time or part-time employees for the company? And in that case, the company would have to evaluate, like, does it make sense to bring all 100 photographers as part-time employees? Do we bring 10 on and, like, cut out the other 90 photographers and so forth? And so the reality of the situation is that some companies might decide, well, we might not need all these full-time photographers, right? And we might want to work with one, or maybe we just use like some of these new AI, tools or something like that. And maybe we ask DALL-E 3 to create different images for us and so forth. Or we ask a current employee to pick up extra shifts doing X, Y, and Z, and maybe photography on the side. I'm not exactly sure, what the company will come up with, but they're going to think about it, right? They're going to be like, do we need to hire these as full-time or part-time employees? And in a lot of cases where it is truly like a contracting relationship where they provide the work on a sporadic and irregular basis, there might not be enough work for the contractor to provide to the company to justify hiring them as a full-time or part-time employee. And so we actually looked at this question empirically. So in 2019, California enacted Assembly Bill 5, AB 5. It was the strictest, and is still the strictest law in the country defining what it means to be an independent contractor. It went into effect in 2020. And again, the rules here are such that they narrow the definition of what it means to be an independent contractor, hoping that companies would hire workers as employees instead, because they think, oh, we can't hire this person as an independent contractor, let's hire them as an employee instead. So that was kind of the justification of the law. The intention is to get more workers to be employees. The kind of secret side justification is that more workers are employees, that they can therefore then join a union and engage in collective bargaining and so forth, because independent contractors legally can't form a union or engage in collective bargaining. So that was the backstory. When it first went into effect, you had news outlets like the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times and Business Insider and all of these reporting on all of these job losses. Because what happened? All of a sudden, these contracting relationships, a freelance musician with a music venue now became illegal. A freelance writer with a magazine now became illegal. And so these organizations, especially small businesses, had to like rethink, what are we going to do about this, this person who writes one article for me a month? And so they reported on all these job losses. And there was no empirical investigation of AB 5. And to be fair, there's no aggregate empirical investigation of any of these reclassification policies in the US. So my research team and I at Mercatus, we were like, let's try to do this. So we used California kind of as a natural experiment in this case. And we looked at data from the using the current population survey. And we wanted to investigate like what happened in California, what happened to employment post AB 5. And what we found actually was that contrary to the desires of the lawmakers to make more workers employees, we don't actually find consistent evidence of an increase in W-2 traditional employment for those affected occupations. So what happened, right? That's a question. Why don't we see consistent evidence that there was an increase in W-2 traditional employment for affected occupations? But what we found instead actually is we found a statistically significant decline in self-employment among affected occupations. And we see that this decline in self-employment was greater for the occupations that have a higher prevalence of being self-employed, which makes sense. So if there's some occupations that aren't very much self-employed, we don't see, huge negative hits to those occupations. But the ones that are more exposed, so to speak, and where you see, these occupations where there's a high prevalence of self-employment, those got hit a lot. And so we see significant declines in self-employment in those occupations. And so that kind of puts a limit and challenges to what the government regulations and what policymakers can do and want to do. Because again, the intention was, let's help more workers become employees. We don't see that happen in California under California's AB5. We don't see consistent evidence that more workers became employees. And in fact, we saw that there was a decline in self-employment and overall employment for the affected occupations.
All right. So, no new permanent full-time employees, but a bunch of part-time gig people lost their jobs.
Exactly. And we actually don't find increases, no consistent evidence of increases even in part-time employees. Like we thought that maybe a bunch of them become part-time employees. But again, there's no consistent evidence that there was an increase even in part-time employees. But a bunch of people lost their contracting gigs, as you said.
Well, yeah, and I think, part of this is I think some people just don't understand how a person who is a sort of freelancer puts their um, puts their career together, right? So someone who, like you pointed out, a magazine could have dozens of freelancers that occasionally provide some photography. Well, no one has a full-time job providing, two photographs a month to one particular magazine, but obviously they have a portfolio of clients. They service a lot of different people. And so if one of the things, this is just sort of like, my perspective here, I think if people look at, these sort of like small jobs here and there, and it looks bad, it looks insufficient, right? And they don't think of that person actually has multiple streams of income from multiple talents and multiple clients, some of which happens on a somewhat regular basis. Somewhat, again, is very sporadic. If you are a wedding photographer, you're probably going to make more money in June than you are in January. Um, but the people who do those jobs have, it's like the analogy from biology, right? They have evolved into that ecosystem, right? They know how to manage it. And so I think people with very stable salary jobs feel a little secondhand anxiety when they think about gig workers, because they think, oh, well, I would be very nervous worrying about paying my bills if I were in that job. Maybe the government should change the rules to make their job easier. But it seems to be it's the person who's doing that job. Maybe she should be making that judgment about whether it's reasonable to work in that way or not.
Yeah, so that's a great point, Richard. And if you talk to people who are full-time freelancers, they actually make the same point. They're like, I have multiple sources of income. So if I lose one gig, right, that I don't go to zero. And they're in a sense entrepreneurial, right? Because they have to find different, so they lost one client, for example. Now they're like, okay, I need to find maybe another client to make up for that. And some of them do make a lot of money. Some of them make, not that much money, and some of them make very low amounts of money. Now the question is, and we should have backtracked for a second. This is my fault. I should have said there's different types of independent contractors, right? Because you have like the high end consultant, freelancing person, and then you also have people who are driving for Uber or DoorDash who don't make that much income, right? And for those, I should mention the vast majority of those who are on these gig economy platforms like Uber, DoorDash, Lyft, Instacart, and so forth, they're supplementary earners. They actually have full-time W-2 jobs. And then they use this as side income. That's for the vast majority of them. And this is according to IRS tax records, by the way. They looked at those tax forms. They connected it to 50 of the largest online platform economies for labor. So Uber and all of them being as part of it. And they found that the rapid increase, and that the workers on those platforms have traditional, and they say this directly, traditional W-2 jobs, and you supplement that income with platform mediated work. And that makes sense because if you look at some of the company, reports as well, they actually say this. They say like most drivers drive 90% of dashers drive less than 10 hours a week. And you're like, okay, is that a job? Is that a full-time job? It's like a side income job, right?
Mhm.
And so that's why it's important to separate these questions of like benefits and protections and health insurance depending on which group we're talking about, because the question of health insurance and labor protections and so forth matters more for the full-time freelancers, the vast majority of whom are making higher income salaries, right? Those workers who work for gig platforms have health insurance for the most part. There's actually a survey done by Jonathan Gruber, who's the head of the economics department at MIT on this. He looked at Uber drivers and he found that the majority of them, 79%, have health insurance. And that's because they either get it from their full-time W-2 jobs or they get it from a spouse and so forth. But that's kind of an important boundary to draw. Be like, which independent contractor are we talking about? Because this workforce is so diverse. And you have individuals who make a small amount of income in this workforce, and then individuals who make, very high amounts in this workforce. So and that's part of the problem with the regulation, like the Department of Labor and California's AB5. They just, ignore the diversity of the workforce. They're like, we're going after the gig economy. But when you try to go after gig economy, you're actually impacting the entire independent contractor workforce. And again, according to IRS tax records, those gig economy companies make up, those workers on those platforms make up less than 10% of the overall independent contractor workforce. So that just gives you an idea of like how large it really is. And again, like I said, it's quite diverse. My co-author and I, we did an analysis looking at all the different types of jobs that are in this workforce, so to speak, and we came up with over 120 different types of jobs that that constitutes the workers who work on and as independent contractors or self-employed and so forth. So it's way beyond Uber and DoorDash or even the freelance musician and photographer. There's quite a bit of different jobs that workers are using for contracting.
Yeah, and one of the things that comes up often in discussions about this, but we should mention too, is the flexibility of gig work, and especially the platforms now, software platforms that allow people to opt in and out of jobs and work whenever they have time available, uh, is a big deal, precisely because, as you pointed out, a lot of the people who we're talking about have other full-time income and therefore would only ever use it as part-time
Mhm.
income. Therefore, they couldn't they couldn't use another full-time job even if the California legislature forced them to, you know, gave them on a silver platter, because that's not the way they use gig work in the first place, right? Um, and so there are obviously there's plenty of examples of people who might want, more, maximum flexibility. Um, and one of these categories is um, uh, what women in general, but if you look at statistics, women obviously do a disproportionate share of the child care in America, but women also do a disproportionate share of the elder care in America in terms of caring for like elderly parents and relatives and things like that. And so one thing some some advocates for gig work have pointed out, including plenty of women themselves who use gig work, is that I can't go out and get a full-time job that's not going to be consistent with the way my life is, right? I don't want a full-time job. I want a part-time job because I want to be able to make some income, but I also need to have it be on my own hours, right? And most even part-time jobs, if you go to a normal part-time job at a brick and mortar store or at a brick and mortar company, they're not going to be able to give you whatever hours you want every single week and every single month. It's only a sort of tech platform intermediated gig work that's going to allow you that sort of maximum flexibility for, in this case, family responsibilities. And I think that's certainly one thing the sort of advocates of like the AB5 perspective, don't. either don't get or don't acknowledge or don't seem to be really valuing.
That is an excellent point, Richard. You hit the nail on the head because that is something we're researching as well. In particular, looking at women as independent workers in the gig economy. I have a study that should be coming out soon, but we use private data. We use data from a gig economy platform to investigate this question of how women exercise flexibility on these platforms as compared to men. And it's over the pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID timeline. So we can actually see this, and we're looking at it alongside with school closure data that happened during COVID as well. But I mean, that's exactly right. We've actually, by the way, interesting. I love talking about the IRS data, but the official IRS data also show that the participation in independent contracting since 2001 has grown significantly more among women than among men. And in particular, these female independent workers have dominated the overall growth in like healthcare, social assistance, and educational services industries. And we do see in some of the studies, and my co-author and I published a study on this as well, women as independent workers in the gig economy, that these flexible job arrangements can be especially transformative for working women who are primary caregivers. And as just one example of a recent study that came out on this, it was an academic study that found that mothers with young children at home use these independent contracting opportunities to spend an additional 2 hours per day with their children. And
Oh,
the study concluded that overall these independent work opportunities give mothers, and I quote, more control over their work environment, allowing them to better manage their household while working. So we actually, there is a study that looks into this specifically about how mothers use these independent contracting opportunities. And by the way, on this question of contractors and mothers as well, the official IRS data also finds that female independent contractors are more likely to have children than female employees. So again, it's probably it's probably the case where you have a mother who is expecting and who pulls out of her full-time job and becomes an independent contractor so that she has primary caregiving responsibilities that she must attend to. But the ability to schedule work around those caregiving activities is crucial for that person and for that mother. And so as a result, that's why we're seeing all of these numbers of women as independent workers in the gig economy, in the broad gig economy sense, not necessarily as your Uber driver or your DoorDasher, but maybe on Instagram or Etsy and so forth as well.
well, that's great. And I think that's sort of, again, one of these angles that is sort of insufficiently appreciated. I know my old friend Tim Carney has a brand new book out called Family Unfriendly, where he makes arguments about how there's various things in American society, both attitudes and policies and laws that make it difficult to like make and to like that stand in the way of family formation and having more kids. And maybe we'll have him on the show to talk about that. But I think that's kind of an example of that. If there's a law that says, oh, you can only be a full-time employee, we're going to steer people away from being able to be contractors, then that gets in the way of all sorts of other things that aren't obviously connected, but once you think about them, you can see how that makes it much more difficult.
And it gets to the earlier point that you made, which is that most often, according to the data, these independent contractors don't want to be employees, right? There's some percentage of them. So I would say the studies indicate about 10 to 20% might want to be employees, but the vast majority, okay, 80 or so percent, want to be independent contractors because there's something that they're getting out of it. It might not be benefits, right? And not maybe these labor protections, but it's this ability to either turn off or on the app whenever you want to work, or just this ability, like for mothers, to be able to manage the household and manage children and taking kids to school and working in between nap times and so forth. That's crucial, and that's hard to find in a full-time or part-time employee. Now, I will say some employers, especially for higher income individuals, might allow that type of flexibility and might allow, and again, it depends on the nature of the work, right? So maybe it's easier to do as a researcher than it is as I don't know, HR manager, right? Because you need to be online for the hours when people need to ask you questions and so forth. But those type of jobs as employment arrangements do exist. Okay. But they're tiny and it's only for higher privileged individuals, right? So, you might have a good bargaining power with your employer because you're super successful and I don't know, popular economist, let's say, not me, but someone else, right? And so you can have that bargaining power with your employer and be like, I need flexibility. They're like, okay, we'll give you the flexibility and so forth. But that's not a characteristic for most employment jobs. And that's why we see a lot of these individuals choosing to go into independent contracting and self-employment opportunities, because they value the flexibility. And especially those who are supplementary earners, like on DoorDash and Uber, like you said, they don't want full-time jobs because they already have one. They want the
Mhm.
ability to like leave their full-time job and, hey, I can pick up a couple hours of work before I have to attend to, you know, a dinner or something like that.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and one topic that's come up in this sort of discussion that we've actually talked about here on the show before is that there's a sort of cyclical process in a lot of political debates and things like this economic regulation, like this workforce regulation, where there's kind of a perennial like grass is always greener on the other side of the fence dynamic. And, so if you go back to like the alleged golden age of the American worker from the 1950s through the 70s, you could, you would have heard back then all sorts of pundits and activists and writers complaining that most jobs are boring, they're repetitive, they're non-creative, they're controlled by your bosses. You have to come in and clock out and go back, and everything is this dull gray sameness, and that's terrible, right? And we need to change that and disrupt that and change things, right? So that's back in the golden age. That's what a lot of people who were writing about the American workforce said, um, and so and now, and so what we needed was to be, fair and supportive of workers and give them freedom and flexibility and self-determination. But that's exactly what the modern economy has given more workers. But a lot of the same, they might be literally some of the same people if they've been around long enough, but people with some of the, like, a lot of the same assumptions about, government regulation, uh, would say now it's terrible the other direction, right? So it was terrible before when there was so little flexibility in the workforce, but now that we have more flexibility, now that's terrible too for the opposite reason, right? And the solution in every situation was the government coming in and like monkey wrenching the American workforce and throwing unused parts over his shoulder as we're trying to like supposedly fix it. Do you think we'll ever get to any sort of settlement in the American workforce where people will stop complaining? Or is there just a certain subset of critics who it's their job to just find something to complain about, even if it's the opposite thing as 50 years ago?
Um, I'm not sure. I think sometimes when there's a special interest in that particular situation. So I think in the case of unions, for example, this is my public choice economist hat on, right? The growth of independent contracting and gig economy work and flexible jobs that are outside of employment is goes against their business model. So they're not going to openly embrace the growth of independent contracting and independent work, even if, right, they truly do see that for some people, this is the way of their life that they choose, right? They could be a high paying employee or they could do something else, right? But they choose to do this and they don't want to be employees. It's hard for them to openly acknowledge that because it goes against their business model, if that makes sense. And so I mean, it's a good question. Will we ever stop complaining about the ways that work, about what's happening in the workforce? I'm not sure, but I'm optimistic about one potential thing, which is that um, we are trying to talk about benefits being separated from employment. So
Mhm.
decoupling benefits from employment. And I'm referring to these as flexible benefits. Other refer to these as, being independent plus benefits models and so forth. But the idea is to rethink our institutional arrangements and our labor regulations and rethink the idea of tying benefits to one type of work, employment. And is there a way to decouple those benefits such that all self-employed independent workers, employees, and so forth can have access to them as well, so that they're not tied only to employment. So there comes a question from some sides of the aisle that are like, we'll make benefits mandatory for any type of work, which is not the right solution. And so I think there's room for experimentation and some thought leadership on what might be a good solution for how to decouple benefits from employment, such that access to benefits is not only available to workers who are employees, that they can be available to other workers like independent contractors. And this is actually written in the regulations, by the way. Um, Currently under many states and under federal law, if you as a client or you as an organization work with an independent contractor, you can't provide benefits for them, because if you provide benefits for them, they look like an employee, so they reclassify them as an employee. And so one small step, right? One small step towards this is to legalize access to benefits for independent contractors by getting rid of this employee benefits test. And by the way, this is not like a secret. It's on the IRS website. They say, like, if we see the presence of benefits to independent
Mhm.
contractors, that will be used against you, because those independent contractors then look like employees, and they state the benefits: health insurance, paid leave, sick leave, and so forth. So it's not a secret, but it is one barrier that prevents the flow of flexible benefits to independent contractors.
All right, that sounds like a good activist campaign. I'll get my T-shirt that just says "Legalize benefits."
Yeah, or flexible benefits for a flexible workforce.
Oh, that's catchier.
Thanks.
Well, Leah, this has been an excellent conversation. Thank you so much for being with us. And before we go, tell us, where can people find all of your amazing work online?
I have a Substack. It's Labor Market Matters, or liyapalagashvili.substack.com, or I'm not sure what the exact URL is. You can also find me on the Mercatus profile webpage. So just search Liya Palagashvili, Mercatus, and the profile page will pop up, as well as a link to my Substack, Labor Market Matters.
All right, fantastic. We could all use at least one more Substack to subscribe to. All right.
Yeah.
Thanks again for being with us, Leah.
Thank you so much.